Go.
Hi, welcome to the Runway to the Future of Funding panel. I'm Ron Curry, the CEO of IGEA. And this panel will explore investment structures from international territories and how they've been created, or how they've created a thriving game development ecosystem and what that might look like if replicated in Australia. So we have three panelists tonight: Tim Scott, Samuel Bessiom, and Christian Fonesbeck, each of whom come from a territory where game development is well supported and thriving in their territories. And we're just going to kind of unpack that and see what that means or what it could mean for Australia. So I might just ask the panelists to introduce themselves, who they are, who they represent, and a little bit about your background. So let's start with Tim.
Thanks very much, Ron. Tim Scott. I'm Head of Policy and Public Affairs at UKI, which is the UK counterpart to IGEA, I guess. We represent pretty much the whole of the games industry in the UK. I think we've got about 480, 490 members, covering one-person indie developers right the way through to the global platforms and publishers. We've also got academic members, the universities, student members, and then all of the, I guess, the support services within our membership as well. So the accountancies, law firms, PR agencies, et cetera, et cetera. So that's who we represent. And then just me briefly, I've been doing this for about 3.5 years, maybe coming up to 4. Prior to that, I spent over a decade in the UK government working for the Department of Culture, Media and Sport and the Cabinet Office, leading on creative industries work. I directly worked on introducing the video game tax relief, which I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about as the conversation goes on. So yeah, I've been in and around creative industries for 15 years or so now.
Great, thanks Tim. Samuel?
Hello everyone, my name is Samuel Berthiaume. I'm a project director at Montreal International. Thanks team, Ron and your team at IGA for the opportunity. So I'm from Montreal International, which is the economic development agency of the Greater Montreal region. Our organization was created back in 1996. We're a non-for-profit organization that's funded by the federal government of Canada, the provincial government of Quebec, the Montreal metropolitan community, and the city of Montreal. And we also have a lot of private members that fund our mission. Among them, we have Ubisoft, Warner Brothers Games, Eidos, and Gameloft. And basically, our mandate is to attract foreign direct investment into our region. But also talent, entrepreneurs, workers, students. And so for those of you who in the audience are not familiar with Montreal, well, Montreal is the second biggest city in Canada after Toronto in terms of population. Our ecosystem is mostly driven by high technology sectors like artificial intelligence, video games, visual effects and animation, aerospace, for instance. And my role is basically to help clients, foreign companies who have an investment project into Montreal, help them set up their expansion. And so I've been doing this at Montreal International since 2018. And before that, I worked at Investissement Québec, or Invest Québec, which is the financial arm of the Quebec government. And I worked in the tax incentive group, that has a focus on technological and video game companies. So I'm very familiar with the very aggressive tax credits that we have in our region to support video game companies. And I'll be happy to discuss with you the key drivers contributing to our game development industry here.
That's great. Thanks, Samuel. And Christian?
Hi, I'm Christian Fonesbeck. I'm from Copenhagen, Denmark. I've produced 35 game projects in my own companies, and I've been head of IP development at Nordisk Film Games, which is the investment arm of Egmont, which is a local media conglomerate. We invested about $140 million in about 6 different companies. I'm currently head of narrative director, what's it called? Narrative director at Deck 13 in Germany. And I'm also consulting for games companies and publishers on IP development. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. I might just ask each of you, so what do you think has been the key driver or the the key contributors to the success that's in your territory? So I'll start, maybe Tim would go maybe in the same order this time.
Oh, you're on mute, Tim.
There would be no Zoom without being on mute. And I think a key driver on that point really is the fact that nobody's come up with an automatic unmute feature yet to spare our blushes. You would have thought we'd got used to it by now. We in the UK, as a UKI, celebrated, I think last year would have been 30 years of the what was UKI before that, ELSPA, the Electronic Leisure and Publishing Association, Software Publishing Association. So there's been a trade body for games for 30 years in the UK, and I think that made us the oldest games industry trade body in the world. We think, therefore, the industry in the UK is probably about 40 plus years old. That's pretty ancient for the games industry, but still a spring chicken for some of the wider creative industry things. Relevance of that means that we kind of, to some extent, were pivotal in the creation of video games as we know them today, and we've been working ever since on creating that environment in which they can thrive in the UK. There's a number of things that you can point to over that 40-year history. And we've seen the sort of rise and ebb and then fall and then rise. Stable regulatory environment, I think, is probably one of the key things that we've looked to maintain at all times in the UK, and that sort of goes across all parts of the sort of policy landscape. Most recently, what we've probably seen comes down to things like the video game tax relief. We introduced that as a relief for the games industry around the sort of 2014 period. And it was in direct response to the work Samuel's been doing in Canada, I guess. You know, I was in the civil service at the time, developing the tax credit. And the challenge from overseas territories, and in particular Canada, but not restricted to Canada, really building and turbocharging their own creative sector and their game sector meant that there was a brain drain, there was a better opportunity outside of the UK, and the laurels that we'd perhaps been resting on were sort of rapidly no longer viable. So putting in that kind of state level support and confidence in the sector has been instrumental in continuing to sort of shore up and then grow again the games industry in the UK. There's loads more, but it's probably a good point to pause.
Yeah, so similar to us, you love the Canadians, you're sick of them stealing our talent.
I think that's probably a fair way to summarize it, yeah.
Samuel White wanted to defend that.
Well, it's sure that we've put some very aggressive financial incentives in Canada, especially in the province of Quebec, to attract companies. So I cannot say otherwise. And it's been the case for a long time. So I don't know in the UK, in terms of tax credits or financial incentives, for how long you've been having these measures. But for us, it goes to understand the main key driver. You have to go all the way back into the early 1990s to understand why we moved this way. At the time, there was no big studio in Canada. There was some independent studios, and there were some very good technological companies like Softimage or Discrete Logic, who Softimage was the company that did Jurassic Park visual effects, for instance. So there was some very good potential, but no Ubisoft. And so the Quebec government, what they did at the time was that to attract talent, but to attract the investors, we had to put together a very aggressive tax credit, which led to the coming of Ubisoft. And then so basically the tax credit, how it works is that it gives developers 37.5% of all the salaries paid back at the end of each fiscal year. So very aggressive. And So Ubisoft, when they came, there was nobody, then 50 employees, then 200, and now they're more than 3,500, 23 years later after this new incentive. And not only them, but other big studios. So I'd say it has been a very successful tool. And it led to I'd say the second key driver, which was the emergence of all the independent studios, because we had a lot of talent working for the AAAs for many years. And so they learned how to produce a game from A to Z. And they got tired of working on the big franchises. They got tired of working on a small aspect of a big game. And with the coming of Unity and Unreal, with the opportunity to self-publish, these guys decided to actually spin off their own studio, and we've seen a surge or a crazy amount of new independent studios that came after the coming of the AAA studios. And so it was expensive for the Quebec government to do that, but bottom line, the economic impact was much greater after so many years, because we have now so many indies that are successful. Some of them are acquired also. And so I think it's been a success, but it's true that we're competing with the world. And so we're trying to keep that in mind when we promote it.
Thanks. Christian, anything to add?
Well, I'm from Denmark, and it's a pretty small country, but people usually lump all the Scandinavian countries together. Mm-hmm. So it might be worth looking at, because they've actually done quite different things. So we've got Denmark, we've got Sweden, Finland, and Norway, or kind of a cluster. But the different approaches have been that Denmark has taken almost a purely cultural approach. So for them, it's been art grants, basically financing startups. And that has had quite direct consequences, as I can see. There are a few bigger studios like IO Interactive and Cybo, who made Subway Surfers and people like that. But the main part of the Danish scene has actually evolved into an art house games scene, which is quite natural when the first grant you can get is only available if you're making art. So just across the water, about 40 kilometers from here, there's Sweden. They've done quite differently. They've done no support at all. But Sweden has a long history of pop culture, right? ABBA, that's all I need to say, basically. Yep. So they have a number of huge studios. They have a massive games industry. And the Swedes have really managed to industrialize it without losing the creativity. But it has not been because of support, because there hasn't been any. Then we've got Finland further up north. And as you know, probably Finland pretty much rules the mobile games industry today. They've done quite a lot of support. For a small company, they've done about 150 million euros over 20 years. And according to the Finnish games industry, the return has been 15 billion euros.
Wow.
But I guess the history of Nokia going bankrupt just before the mobile games industry took off, and all the engineers from Nokia leaving in Finland and starting to make mobile games companies, that has a part of it too, right? It's not just government support, but that combination has been quite unbeatable for a very specific type of game. And then there's Norway. Norway is really a younger country, games-wise. They seem to be heading towards the Danish model, where it's very culturally funded. And then just to the south, we've got Germany, of course, and they're getting into the race right now. Their government has just placed 50 million euros a year for 4 years to the games industry, so that's quite significant. And they have some real industrial muscle. I myself work a lot in Germany for the same reason. Yeah, that's a little overview.
So has Australia left it too long? Are we too late to this race?
I wouldn't say at all. And, you know, from what Christian was just saying then, we're in the UK sort of actively looking at the Finnish model, and tech, as people talk a lot about, and the sort of 150 million versus 15 billion return. Yes, there was the Nokia engineer situation, but that tech talent does exist, and as a territory, you can easily attract it. And kind of going back to my previous point, I'm not saying that the Canadian industry was built on UK talent, like whole scale upping and moving over there. But if you make the right offer, having spent some time in Australia, you know, there's a sort of a quality of life issue that weighs quite heavily. You know, this is, where do people want to sort of stay and work? And if the incentives are right, if the state intervention is about that sort of positive attitude, you know, we welcome that innovation, we welcome all and everyone if they can contribute to the sector, then you can really attract that talent in. And there's probably never been, I mean, particularly if you look at it through a very recent COVID lens, the games industry's demonstrated huge resilience where many other sectors haven't. It's fundamentally that blend of technology and creativity, that culture and tech as an industry. Then it's probably the right time now to put your faith in a forward-thinking sector like the games industry and really sort of grow it yourselves.
Yeah, I agree with Tim. Another aspect here in Quebec is the fact that since we're francophone in North America, we've had to collaborate in order to thrive or to survive to some extent. Historically speaking, the French culture has had to fight to maintain and to prosper and to live. But in the business world, what we've developed as a culture is that we go through industry cluster a lot in order to make representation before the government. And it's the Quebecers in general are very collaborative within themselves, but also we welcome a lot the foreign and direct investments, not only in video game, but in other sectors. And we've used that strategy of using tax incentives for other sectors like visual effects, but we didn't go through financial incentives to build other clusters, but we were able to be successful without putting together another tax credit, but just by being able to, for instance, in the clean tech or the lithium battery industry, we've tried to really put together something as the entire supply chain come together and say, okay, what can we do in the field of the lithium battery that is relevant worldwide, globally relevant to all the investors in this field, without putting together a tax credit, but instead providing an environment where it is welcome for foreign investors, for innovators, and if the government can play the support role, I think you can replicate this model if you collaborate within the ecosystem and outside of the world also, and go outside, bring a delegation of the mayor, say, or politician with all the main industrial companies. I think it's possible to replicate the same kind of successful model.
Christian, anything?
Yeah, I don't think it's too late. I don't think it's ever too late in the games industry. One of the things that's been consistent is that games are always changing. And, you know, since they're always changing, that means there's always room for new teams and new talent to rise. In fact, some would argue that new teams have an advantage because they're not encumbered by the old model that went out of date 3 months ago. Right. It's been really a sector with very rapid change. Mobile games went from 0 to 50% of the games industry in just, what, 4 years, 5 years, something like that?
Pretty quickly.
What's next? Altered reality games? Who knows? So yeah, I mean, if you look at the same time at what Weta did in New Zealand, you know, was it too late for New Zealand to get on the movie industry? No, it really wasn't. It was about having talent that really made an impact.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's what I would look at, is that, you know, the successful games studios are always expanding and building satellite studios. So where are they going to build them? Well, there's two things. One thing is, of course, the financials, tax and support schemes and so on. But another thing is the talent. Where is the talent? If the talent is in Australia, then the studios will start to move there if there are other benefits as well. And I think, you know, if Australia is serious about this, they might want to think about what kind of angle can you put on the talent? What kind of education or other kind of system can you put together that means that Australia has unique talent to offer? Because exactly as Samuel said, it may start by the big people moving in, but then the knowledge splinters out into new independent studios and it becomes an industry in itself. So the question is, what's the point of attack? And I think it's the talent, to be honest.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think there's a real opportunity. I think certainly we see it in the UK as a, it's almost, how do you encourage the policymakers in education to embrace games, and not just games, but, you know, games very much as a former civil servant who kind of worked with other departments, and even within the DCMS, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, games were still are to an extent very much the sort of the poor cousin. It's the, you know, the pursuit of boys in basements and bedrooms, you know, who aren't, you know, getting enough exercise and not getting out enough. It's not seen as culturally important as film or TV or literature or what have you. And yet actually it's all of those things, and it's hugely influential and really is the sort of the modern medium. So how do you embrace that at the education level, and how do you put computing and computer science on the curriculum, standing shoulder to shoulder with maths and physics, but also history and art? Because you can encourage not just a generation of game developers, but that whole kind of tech industry. You bring the AI, you bring the AR, the mixed reality, whatever it is this week. Our current government have got an obsession with 2-letter acronyms, but they don't seem to be doing too much about, you know, actually instilling it right the way down at primary school level. So, you know, as Christian says, the big investors can start to look at, well, what's happening in Australia, or what's happening in Sydney or Melbourne or whatever, Adelaide, is really, really interesting. There are AI startups that are doing stuff there that isn't happening anywhere else in the world, and that becomes a satellite, and that satellite then generates the next innovation, which becomes the pivotal piece behind PlayStation 6 or you know, whatever, you know, mobile function that we're going to be playing the games on. So it's a long game. An absolutely long game, but there's not that many territories around the world really embracing that as an opportunity and really thinking progressively about the education system as well as the industrial and economic consequences of it.
Samuel and Christian both touched on a subject which is often an elephant in the room here, and that's, you know, create an environment that attracts the AAAs, and they'll just come here and they'll just stomp over everything, and that'll be the end of the ecosystem. And it was interesting hearing you both speak from different points of view about how that actually helps the ecosystem rather than crushes it. And I'd be quite interested maybe to flesh that out a little bit. You know, what does an environment that supports AAAs look like for the individual game developer? So not for we often talk about what does it mean for UB, what does it mean for EA, but what does it mean for someone who's a couple of years out of college, got a degree, and looking for a long-term sustainable career?
It creates a lot of opportunities, well, for the employees, that's for sure, or for the people who want to hire. What we've seen is that they can offer great jobs, and they've become the schools, basically, in Montreal, those big AAA studios. And all of the indies, they poach into Ubisoft, into Warner Brothers. And Ubisoft and Warner Brothers, when they're in your town, they also bring in foreign talent, a lot of immigrants into the ecosystem at the same time. So it's a training school. People can have a very interesting career in these global companies, and also I think that there's a trickle-down effect into the rest of the ecosystem. Fortunately for us, we've been lucky enough that we've had companies that those big studios have been very much involved into the community. So they didn't come only to pick talent. So they're very invested. They've created neighborhoods that used to be not created, but they've helped neighborhoods thrive and get out of almost poverty to some extent because of the economic impact that they had when they hired so many people. So I think there's, for people who want to have a long-standing career in the video game industry, well, they offer a lot of opportunity, whether it's to work here or then to move abroad. If you want to go work in Paris or in California for a while, these companies offer global opportunities. And you can, if you're an independent studio, maybe you can have a joint venture with them or a co-development production. Business, in terms of business, they offer opportunity also. That's what we've seen a lot here.
And when you say trickle down, are you talking about people who come and get their education within a larger studio, then go and create their own studios?
Exactly, yes. Create their own studios, and then they would become independent or becoming very successful and being acquired then by another big studio. That's something that we've seen a lot, and it's the phase that we're into right now. A lot of M&As, mergers and acquisitions, at the moment here. It's kind of a third wave, I'd say, of the industry here. A lot of acquisitions.
Yeah, I don't think I would be worried about having the AAA stomp all over everything, as you say. I mean, the thing about games industry is that it's the closest you can get to rock and roll and still play with computers, right? That's a lot of indies. That's what they're doing. They're going into rock and roll with computers. And if you have a AAA, you know, there's always going to be people for whom that's the perfect spot to be in. But there's also going to be people for whom that's just too constraining. You know, as you say, working on an existing franchise is, for some people who are at one end of the creativity scale, that's extremely stifling. And they're going to split at some point and look for something more creatively satisfying. So if I look around Scandinavia, the countries that have done really well are the ones who have managed to appeal to both the passion and the business side of games. And I think the countries that have done not so well have focused exclusively on the passion. And they've won a lot of prizes, but they haven't actually managed to build industries. So for me, this is a breaking point in many places, is that, you know, the business school kids don't want to talk to the art school kids, and vice versa, right? They don't drink in the same places, they don't speak the same language, they don't dress the same, they think each other are idiots. If you can change that, you're well on your way, you know, because making an independent studio is a passion, but it's for damn sure also a business. And what most often goes wrong in indie studios is that it's only passion. And then it's only passion for a while and then it's dead. So if you can get the business school people to talk to the game school people or art school people, that would be an angle that could work.
It's the t-shirts and suits kind of analogy where, you know, the creative industries more broadly are the t-shirts. I think there's an important point there, which is about how that AAA studio interacts with the universities and higher education institutes in the area as well. Because if you can create that kind of healthy pipeline, I guess, coming through it, then you're able to build a bigger talent base, which means that there are more people to sort of continually sort of come through, so that when people move out of that AAA experience and they've cut their teeth on how to make games, but not necessarily understand that wider context of how a business works, then there's always a sort of a pipeline of graduates coming through. But also to that point, the emphasis is not nearly enough, certainly in the UK, the emphasis is not nearly enough on that entrepreneurialism, on that business sense. So pretty much exactly Christian's point, but you can put this into universities as well, so that the students are working in a sort of a business mind frame, so that they're coming out a little bit more kind of like savvy as to what's required.
So if we have suits and if we have t-shirts, or whichever way we're going to look at it, how do we start engaging, for example, the VC community with game developers?
Well, I actually think that is exactly where you start to engage them. I think when you hear independent game developers complaining that the venture capitalists just aren't interested, it's usually because they're not presenting a business. Venture capitalists are interested in businesses. And if you're presenting them with a passion project, you're just not speaking the same language. So actually, that's my first piece of advice usually when I get asked this question is, are you presenting a business case? Because if you are, the investor doesn't even have to understand games, because they understand business.
Yeah, it seems almost so obvious, but we're doing this a lot in the UK through things like the London Games Festival, but also the UK student programs, for example. And it's just going through that whole point about pitch training. It's alarming how often it happens that here is, I've got this amazing product, and it is the most off the wall, esoteric, private thing that obviously you're all idiots for not understanding why I've come up with this specific sort of idea, and the investors just walk a mile because there's no interest in that whatsoever. So there's a real opportunity there for the likes of IGEA, but also for government to sort of like invest in that pitching.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, is there a direct relationship between government's commitment to the industry, so by way of whatever funding, is that a signal to VCs that this is somewhere you should be? So conversely, is the absence of that a disincentive to VCs?
That's not my impression. I think there are cases that go both ways. In Sweden, it's happened without the government interest. In Finland, it happened with the government interest. So I think it's about, are there successes? That's what creates momentum.
Yeah. In Canada, the governments are very much engaged in the funding of new video games. Mm-hmm. So putting aside the tax credit, there's also at the federal level, there's what we call the Canada Media Fund experimental stream, and so it's a program where the Canadian government can fund up to 75% of project costs to a maximum of $1.5 million of a project. So the only eligible criteria, among the criteria, you've got to have your headquarter in Canada, and you have to be Canadian controlled. So this was the result to the call by some indies that there's no VC, actually. It's really hard to get funding. And so the Canadian government wanted to invest or create investment opportunities for Canadian controlled company to work on their own intellectual property, because obviously when you have the foreign studios, well, the rights of the IP would be outside of the country. So that's one way that the Canadian government has been trying to address this, I'd say, lack of funding in the gaming sector by creating its own funding that is pan-Canadian.
Tim, just jumping back to you a little bit, and given that you've worked on the government side and now on the trade association side, do you have any view on where ownership should sit on ensuring that those studios are investment ready? You're talking about pitching and just being ready to be a business. Where should that responsibility to help them get there sit?
I think the short answer is that it shouldn't sit in any individual place, and that might be a glorious civil service fudging the answer type answer. But if you put that responsibility solely, on the hands of local government or a regional development agency or academic institution, whatever, then it will, I think, automatically stifle the growth and stifle the innovation that comes through it. So really what you want to do is get a situation where there is sort of broad collaboration going on. And we've seen this in the UK to an extent, but I think there's an opportunity for more. So this is where, if you look at what we're doing in the UK on kind of like trade and inward investment, FDI, that sort of stuff, we generally, as the trade body, work really closely with the Department for International Trade. And if it's in a specific area, then we'll get the local economic partnership involved as well. Mm-hmm. And between all of those, you've got the sort of the local idea, the local organization seeing, well, it can be in that building and it can work with that academic institution, for example. You've got the government DIT, as it were, that looking at it from a much bigger sort of perspective, a wider perspective, which doesn't focus on this is a games industry. This focuses on, what does investment look like? And what are the levers that we can pull on that? And that might look at stable regulatory environment more broadly, or what's the IP regime like, for example. And then from a trade body, we're the ones who can we can run missions, we can round up our members and speak directly to them in their language. So I think it has to be a kind of spread across everyone, and that's definitely what I saw from the other side of the fence, as it were. It was always easier and more productive to working in collaboration.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to add to that? So if there's some conversations we've had locally is that, if the government are going to support an industry and fund it, and there's a whole bunch of reasons we can agree why, what does industry owe government around that? Like, for example, what do we owe government around issues of diversity, for example? Should there be is it a two-way street? Should there be some obligation on industry?
Yeah, about us. Oh, go ahead, Christian.
Go, Christian. Yeah.
Well, I don't see why not. I'm not part of the government in any way, so I don't know how that is thought in. But it's a huge issue for game developers everywhere, and it's something we're talking about on a daily, weekly basis. Is there enough diversity in the game design? Is there enough diversity in the story we're telling? So honestly, it feels like it's a movement that's already happening, and I don't see why it shouldn't be part of what the government is asking.
I think the key for that would be how can we better integrate the immigrants, and that's it. In Canada, we have a very favorable immigration policy. There's a lot of immigrants. We depend on them to have a prosperous economy, and I think that video game industry could be a very good way to become a more inclusive society. There's a lot of opportunity there. How can we help these people enter the economy? And I think the video game could be a good place. Different views of the world, different opinions, origins. It's already the case in the industry. A lot of people come from abroad. Many languages are mixed up, but I think this industry could definitely be a great way to provide assistance to the immigrants if they want to better integrate the society. There's a lot of funding.
If I can just interrupt you there, I'm sorry. I understand that from your viewpoint, but I have to say, I think it takes more effort than that. I think, traditionally it has been very much a white male dominated industry. It's very engineering heavy and, rich white boys with expensive toys.
just look around the panel here. So that, yeah.
Exactly. I'm just saying that I think it's very much a part of the conversation at developer level today. But if you're handing out government money, I don't see why you wouldn't make it part of the package.
Tim, would that be a brave government statement, or would it be brave of industry to go to government with that scenario? Either way,
it's nowhere near as straightforward as that, unfortunately.
Correct.
There's a real danger if you take the tax credits, for example. So we've got tax credits in many territories now, not least the Canadian and the UK ones. But a tax credit is an incredibly blunt instrument, and trying to use a tax credit to influence the diversity agenda, I think, is not necessarily the most effective tool that we have. That you can already get in the UK video game tax relief, for example. There's we have a cultural test, which is part of the European state aid cultural exception, etc. But there are points available for diversity within the game and the people making it. So there is opportunity there, but it's not the most effective way of doing it. I'd say responsibility perhaps is shared, but it's shared from the perspective of games industry should be doing and can do a lot more. It can do a lot more to attract different people. Christian's point, more people from different backgrounds into the industry. It's not I don't think it's an issue of the global workforce. 30% of the UK industry is from Europe, mainland, another 15 from the rest of the world, but the sort of ethnicity and gender diversity still, we've got a lot to achieve, long way to go. But that could be the advantage. We talk about compelling stories, and we talk about engaging audiences, etc., etc. So getting those groups represented in the development can be to the developers and publishers' advantage. That, when I say it's shared, and there was knock at the door, that's the Amazon delivery that we were expecting. There is. I suppose from a government perspective, it kind of goes back to a little bit to what I was saying before about the education. What's happening at the education level to encourage more people to continue with computing and continuing with creative subjects at school and beyond and into university. What's that engineering and physics throughput into university? But also what's the industry doing going out to schools and encouraging the next generation to go, hey, this is a fantastic career and you could be part of it. So there's a real shared opportunity there.
We're getting close to wrap up time, so just thought I'd just check. Is there anything anyone would like to add that we haven't covered off, or that you'd like to add some further detail on?
Yeah, I have one thing that I'm seeing a few times, which is that when the indies make their original games, again, I guess it comes back to the business thing, but they're seldom thinking beyond the first game. And both for an investor and for a government, that's a bit of a killer, because you're actually not investing, you're gambling on whether this one game will be a hit or not. So taking the long-term perspective is obvious from a government point of view, but from a developer point of view, it really isn't. And that would be a thing I would encourage, thinking of the game as potentially a series, potentially an intellectual property, thinking of the long-term business side of it. That's something that's often missing also for the investors.
That's great.
Maybe on the public policy side, I'd say that having, I mentioned it earlier, but having a favorable immigration policy is a very key asset to be competitive globally, to attract talent. So in the context of North America, for us, when we compare ourselves with the actual United States administration, who's restricting H-1B foreign worker visa program, and on our side of the border, we have a prime minister who says we're open to immigration. Mm-hmm. Well, it helps us a lot to attract people and to have specific programs for developers, which we have now. It helps our clients a lot to bring people when they want to build their teams. I'd say it's a very important asset to consider at the public policy level.
Yeah, and I think you're very right there, Samuel, and it's something that IGEA is doing a lot of work on at the moment, directly with our Department of Home Affairs. And we're continually waving the Canadian, flag in their face, telling them how easy it is for our developers or any developer to get into Canada, and yet we make it almost impossible for, developers to make their way into Australia. So I think that's a really important point. Funding's one thing, but access to talent is it's no good getting funding if there's no one here to work, and no one here to train the people who need to work. Tim, before we go, is there anything to add?
Yeah, it sort of speaks directly to that, I guess, which is sort of, it's being open-minded as a government to the potential of the games industry. We've got, I think, the productivity of employees in the games industry in the UK, at least, is comparable to the sort of square mile, bankers, etc. It's highly productive, highly skilled, modern, forward-thinking, innovative sector. It should be something to be embraced from a public policy perspective, and therefore, how does that translate on big things like immigration, but also on sort of more local, what are the local incentives, and how can you encourage the establishment of these sectors in your town and your city? And that might be broadband, or that might be grants to set buildings up or kit them out with the right stuff. But it's being open-minded to the potential of the sector, I guess.
Excellent. Look, I'm a bit bummed that Raylene only gave us 45 minutes for this session, because I'm sure we could probably go for another 45 if time zones permitting. But Tim, Samuel, and Christian, thank you so much for joining us and being so generous with your time, and not just here, it's leading up to it and making yourself available. Thank you to everyone who's joined us for the panel. If you'd like to carry the conversation further with the IGEA team, please reach out to myself, Jens, or Ben, and we'd be very happy to have the conversation with you about how we move the dial for Australia. So thanks again, and enjoy your next session.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And